Welcome to Ancient Wales, Episode 1, Where to Begin. In 2016, when we started the podcast, I have to admit I only had a foggy idea about some of the subject matter I was covering. And as I started that process, I did realize early that there was a lot that could be covered and should be covered, and I struggled to actually get it working in a way that made sense. So revisiting this, one of the things I definitely want to accomplish, and I'm kind of prefacing the whole series with this, is I want to do a better job of covering what we covered. And so with that in mind, here we go. As I said, when we started in the beginning, we started from the arrival of humanity to what we called the British Islands around 10,000 BCE, a period where there was still a land bridge from Britain to the mainland, which was a fairly wide one, if we're honest, called Doggerland, effectively taking up most of the English Channel and parts of the North Sea. This series will start around 800 BCE, at a time when our ancestors were now on a proper island, where culture and communities were growing, and much of what makes up this period can be described at least a little clearer. The Iron Age marks a key period in British prehistory, where the use of iron tools and weapons allowed for the advancements in agriculture, warfare, and societal structures. We are talking about a period likely filled with chieftains, tribal amalgamations, and family groups or clans growing in number and influence. Bronze Age Britain was one of innovation, but it was a slow innovation. As pointed out so very long ago, it took time for the use of bronze to travel from Mesopotamia to Europe, and from various parts of Europe to Britain, especially on how to produce it in regular amounts that would create enough tools, armor, and weapons that could turn this age on its head. Another part of this slow, gradual change was how it migrated. The initial use of bronze began in the Near East about 3300 BCE. This is not when it arrived to be used and collected in Britain. As you can imagine, it was kept secret and safe for some time. Production was not easy, and many likely held on to their tools and implements when they got them because of the cost in production and lack of knowledge. In Europe, bronze making traveled into the Balkans first, seemingly independent of the Near East, with the production of weaker tin bronze specifically, a process that was less durable, but it made bronze tin, which was created through lower temperatures. Even with that, there is a gap about 1500 years where there is no bronze production at all, showing that the process was lost at some stage in Europe. At that point, areas around what we now call Greece began to produce higher quality bronze around 3200 BCE. Around 1200 BCE, bronze was out of favor as iron had replaced it as the tool of choice. This also coincided with the Bronze Age collapse that saw empires fall, civilizations collapse, and in some cases new ones start that would feature in the history of the world even to this day. Bronze usage in Central Europe began just before the collapse, sometime between 2300 and 1600 BCE, as areas in Hungary, Poland, and Germany during these time periods saw more bronze usage. As bronze migrated from east to west, more and more cultures were influenced by it, and through trade and knowledge exchange, either by means of trade or possibly through violent conquest, this spread the knowledge from one society to another. Britain, which had largely been an unknown Neolithic place where evidence of humanity is very hard to find, and if it was found, it was in very small pockets across the island, meet at some point with the Bronze Age around 2100 BCE, as a band of new people brought with them new ideas and new understandings, and one of which, of course, was the key to make bronze. We know through archaeology that these people were from a different location due to an examination of the tooth enamel isotopes found in the grave sites. Due to the way teeth grow, and as they do, capture air, food, and other particulates, it allows them to grow with this embedded into their teeth. This then makes it easier when you're identifying aspects of someone's early life, generally because as a child, we have baby teeth. As adult teeth come in, they will have evidence of where that person grew up, at least for the first few years of their life, and give you a good understanding of where they came from. The examination of Bronze Age Britons buried around Stonehenge showed that these people were migrants from modern-day Switzerland. They had different cultural practices, but also came from different places where these practices were very likely normal. These migrants recreated Britain in their image, and at least in some places influenced quite a bit of the cultural exchange. This went against the ideas of some of the archaeologists in the 60s who had argued that the beaker culture was more of a trade and sharing of cultural practices rather than some likely invasion. And this may have been the case for some parts of Britain, but there's enough evidence to show that there were people actually migrating across for whatever reason. We can't identify that there was some mass movement for a war or empire building or something along that line, but what we can show is we do show that people have come from other parts of Europe, migrated into Britain, and then settled there and intermingled enough that rather than being effectively overwhelmed in the DNA of others, we can actually trace that evidence. Intermarriage and likely trade, and maybe even to some extent conquest, all played a part in changing the dynamic of the way the people of Britain lived, laughed, and loved. Thanks to these arrivals, there was a replacement of about 90% of the local Neolithic-derived lineage, likely through a combination of ways, including the development of stronger traits from the new bronze-wielding interlopers. DNA evidence in the past decade has shown that there were still people who were descendants of the earliest arrivals to Britain. Like their latter descendants, they lived on the western periphery, where it was hard to get to and remained isolated from the intermarriages that were dominating the rest of the island. This would be evident in places like northwest Wales, where there is DNA evidence to show that people exist or existed in that area for up to 10,000 years, or up to the original Ice Age arrival. We would come to know these Bronze Age people by one of their unique burial practices, which included a special placement of what are now called beakers. This bell beaker culture arrived around 2450 BCE, and this migration continued until 1800 BCE, when the culture was widely dispersed across Western Europe. Unlike the Neolithic peoples of Britain, who were often buried with family and tribal members in collective cairns or kists, the Bronze Age saw a focus more on burying individuals. The reason they thought that these burials were specifically for status members is because they would have a generous number of precious goods buried with them, or what we perceive to be precious and significant goods to that person. Sometimes things, such as in the case of the mold cape, were signs of significant status. Remember, that's a gold chained cape, which was one of the more fascinating finds ever to be found in Wales and actually symbolizes the wealth of Britain at the time. Sometimes it could come down to just being buried with stylized pottery. The beakers that we've mentioned give this culture its name, as well as beads and at times their tools and weapons that would also be interred with them. You have to imagine these are not elaborate pharaoh-like tombs. They're basically small areas, and typically people may be cremated. They may be buried after having just their bones left over and being exposed. They might be actually buried in as what we would consider to be a normal burial, where a person is inhumed into whatever it is that they decide to bury them in. And they are usually put in an almost fetal position, and at their feet would be their various goods that they would take with them. We would assume, because we don't know, to the afterlife. And that was why generally it's felt that most people were buried with grave goods, was it was a symbol of them being buried with the items they would need as they entered into the afterlife. There may be other reasons. It may be more like our own time, where it would be more about burying them with something significant, something they loved. Maybe it was a prized possession. Or again, going back to our original discussion, maybe it was just down to the fact that it was significant enough and symbolized their status enough that that's why they were buried with it. So it all comes down to a various amount of ideas. As the Bronze Age ended and the Iron Age began, cremation continued to be a popular method of burial, but there were later shifts towards what we would consider to be cemeteries to bury the dead. This shift is interesting, but might be explained by the increasing settlement of people into agricultural communities now living in various locations across Britain that were settling down and not moving about. Now, when we talk about agricultural communities with iron tools and iron implements, you can do a lot more, and we're going to get into that in a little bit. And that allows you to have more time to settle down and do things. It is important to note that this was not universal across Britain. For example, in Wales, cremation burials were still fairly consistent and normal. It's also maybe that only certain important people were buried this way due to their status, where lower status people would still be receiving old style burials or cremations and other options. The other question that we cannot be sure about is how much continental contact was influencing the practices and the cultural changes that were happening in Britain. The later Bronze Age was a period where travel and trade were much larger, first in the Mediterranean and then up and down modern Spanish, Portuguese, French, and British coastlines. As people began to range farther and farther, so did their ideas and the people themselves. This was a change from the Stone Age, where travel was fraught and difficult, where hunter-gatherers were slowly turned into farmers, and they had settled in their specific areas. Over time, as people had settled and migration began to end in the ways of the hunter-gatherers, they would then move into the interior, spreading bronze usage to sites like Great Orme, an area not on the edge, but we'll talk, or not in the interior, but we'll talk a little bit about that, to become sites of significance. In the past, Great Orme was suggested by archaeologists to be a place where bronze tools were made and fashioned. The Welsh site north of Llandudno was a seasonal and rare mining area, according to these people. However, there's been recent work done that has shown that this is probably incorrect, and that industrial sites like this ended up being buried in part by Victorian-era mining, doing a much more efficient and effective job, but also bearing evidence in the process, and the entire limestone mound may have been mined off and on for about 3,000 years. And so as time goes on, it makes it difficult to trace what's happening at all times. What has been suggested through the work of Dr. R. Allen Williams is that far from being a small seasonal labor mine, Great Orme was a central point for Bronze Age mining and smelting. Williams and his colleagues were able to note that this method, specifically built around the way smelting bronze was done in the middle part of the Bronze Age, showed that there was a greater abundance of mining being done here because of what was here, and that they were able to show that more smelting was going on as well. He suggested that the height of mining was about 200 years, something that would make it multi-generational at the minimum. And this was in part because copper was easily mined out from this particular location, in part because it was above the water line. There were two great sources of copper that were to be found, and they were dug out roughly between 1600 BCE and 1400 BCE. This would have been the heyday for the site due to the access eventually to the water line and to the local seas, allowing them to ship and make trade of copper and bronze across what would assume to be a fairly diverse location. As with the transition to the Neolithic to the Bronze Age, the transition to the new material, iron, did not happen in one full swoop. The use of iron was, again, a slow and deliberate transition. The Iron Age began as the Bronze Age came to an end around 750 BCE in Britain, as once again cultural shift, followed by a precedent of migration, brought ironworking from Central Europe to the islands. Due to extensive trade links, and likely these links were created over the Bronze Age, innovations were arriving to Britain with enough frequency, and likely trade going back to the mainland in exchange eventually led for these items to be not only imported and used, but also copied. Early in the period that we call the Iron Age, an area around Austria called Hallstatt had slashing swords and daggers that were being used and made in iron in the area and then exported. Hallstatt, Austria was a center of iron innovation around 900 BCE to about 400 BCE. This culture was also claimed to have links to earlier expansion of what we would eventually come to know as or call the Celts. It would be them that would establish some of the early Celtic cultural practices. The area was rich with salt, which allowed it to trade to Mediterranean kingdoms and city-states. This then allowed them to bring iron into the area, and of course, iron tools and examples of iron weapons. And as the trade came about, so too with the knowledge translation and transition. And now, all of a sudden, instead of just importing iron weapons or iron implements, they're now making them themselves. To this stage, at least, iron in Europe had not been used on such a large scale or to such a high level of craftsmanship. The finds in Hallstatt graves include swords, decorated vessels, and horse trappings of quality and artistry to that point, especially in this part of Europe, that had never been seen before. Their elaborate swords often had very decorative hilts, some of which were called antenna hilts because they had large antennae-looking implements that went at the end of the hilt, and they would become quite elaborate. This was a very distinctive look and feel, and definitely made it a lot easier to identify where the swords were being traded. As these swords were made, at least as far as we know, they were definitely being used in burials. Maybe they were just very elaborate because they were being used in burials and never used as actual weapons on the battlefield. But it's hard to know for sure. But yet, you would imagine that you wouldn't just make an iron sword to never use it and just bury it with someone as they died in some sort of ceremonial fashion, with the difficulty that you would have in making them. But you can't say for sure necessarily. Another feature of this culture, one that would be practiced in Britain, was the burial of what was called wagon graves. These are placed at the center of a wooden mortuary house, and they would include the person and all of their various weapons and tools and pottery to indicate the status of the person. Likely, this was never going to be about just your average low-status person, Joe Farmer, but rather it's probably the chief or the king or queen or chiefess, take your pick, or possibly a religious figure who's being buried and acknowledged because of their status. In Britain, these people would be buried in what would later be called chariot graves because they were buried with chariots and in some cases even with horses, something that was obviously a copy of that style. And they would also have with them their spears and shields and often, like I said, recognitions that they were likely status and high status people. Towards the end of the Iron Age, burial customs began to shift as the influence of Roman culture started to seep into Britain. However, many local traditions proceeded and continued into the centuries beyond that, including barrow burials, something that started in the Bronze Age, and stone kist burials, which had started in the Neolithic. As the trade practices and art styles spread out from Austria, so too did the culture itself, and by 6th century BCE, these distinctive burial styles and ironwork craftsmanship had crossed Austria, reaching Germany, Switzerland, and France, and by 4th century BCE, they had reached Ireland and the UK. Hallstatt was a brand new European cultural phenomenon that formed the foundation of later Iron Age developments, such as the so-called Celtic Latine culture, where the cultural shift becomes much more what we would identify as being Celtic in nature. The shift to ironworking allowed for stronger and more durable tools and weapons, and a change in the landscape of society. It meant that those with iron had an advantage over bronze-tooled people who did not have the same ability to work the land and had to fight harder in order to get what they wanted out of the land. Iron-tipped plows could turn soil more quickly and deeply. Older wooden and bronze ones would never be able to keep up with. Iron axes could clear forest land more efficiently for agricultural use. As with our own time, when you have the newest technological device, it becomes a bit of a constant chase to find that next great way of doing something. Your local farmer, watching the neighbor clearing the landscape quicker and more efficiently, would obviously note this and may even have some point of jealousy over it. More importantly, getting crops into the ground faster was a life and death matter. Getting a harvest done quicker, life and death matter. Quickly, the need for this implements and the desire to achieve these things in order to avoid the worst aspect of life, which was starvation or at least privation, meant that iron tools became much more popular. So iron, far from only being used as a weapon for invaders, would also be symbols for progress and success. You could almost see a clever Iron Age marketer selling these things. Remember that bronze plow 1.2 that your dad swore by? Well, now you have Iron Plow 1.0. Faster, better, more durable. You never feel the same way in the field again, as you can gather your crops safe in the knowledge that iron is your saving grace. And because of that, people would cling on maybe to the old, but most would adopt the new. Think about it. Once upon a time, we all had flip phones and we all were very excited about texting. And now everybody looks at their phone as a little mini computer that you don't really use for a phone as often as you might have once done. All of these things and these transitions happen. Now, is this happening in the same way? No, of course not. Is it happening at the speed that I've just described? No, of course not. Is there a marketer running around selling iron in the streets? Maybe, but probably not. But yet, the idea that someone is going around hawking these items and saying, look, this is better, quicker, faster, stronger, it's going to affect people. It's going to make them rethink their choices. And yeah, there would be that kind of marketing about for these things because, let's be honest, you can exchange for more goods with better tools. The person selling the tool can get more goods for them. Keep in mind, we're not talking about a system of money. In this age, we're talking about barter. You know, you didn't trade 7 shekels or shillings or pounds or dollars or cents or any of that for, you know, the local sheep or the wool that you need or whatever. It was, you've got wool, I've got some pigs. You've got copper, I've got a bit of wood that I've collected, which you might be able to use to make implements. All of these things are tradable items that people would exchange. And in this era, just like many eras before and after, for many, many years to come, that would be the method that these people would acquire these things. And because of the value, likely, unless you broke it, you kept it. And you kept using it until you broke it. and you hoped you can repair it so that you wouldn't have to go out and try and buy another one effectively or trade for another one. So that's something to keep in mind as we go through this, and especially in this period. This starts to change, obviously, with the Romans, but that's still many years to come. We, of course, have sped through the Bronze Age, but we'll revisit a lot of its themes as we talk about the Iron Age and the transition that we see in Britain of Iron Age life. But we still have a lot to talk about before we even get anywhere near the Roman period, because we need to talk about what life was like for Iron Age people. How did they fight? What was their religion? What kind of art did they do? Who were the tribes that inhabited Britain, and how were they divided? And how do we know anything about them at all? And also, as time went on, where did people go for safety? Where and what was the reason why they lived the way they did? All of these things are going to be talked about over the next few months, and I hope you'll continue to join me with this particular series. It's a lot of fun. I'm quite enjoying it. I'm feeling like it's giving me an opportunity to really deeply dive into this period in a way I really didn't have enough information to do previously. So I'm happy to share this with you. I hope you're enjoying it. And if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com. Or if you're on social media, you can reach out to me on Twitter, formerly known as, of course, now X, at Welsh History Pod, or on Facebook at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. And also, you can always help out the podcast, if you so prefer, through Patreon and through a donation there. All of the money that's donated there helps me to gather the research I use to make these episodes. Thank you all for everything that you do with Patreon and every one of my patrons. I cherish your donations and I appreciate them tremendously. And I thank everybody who listens to this podcast, who shares it about, because without you, I couldn't do this. Thank you so much. Take care. Have a lovely rest of your day. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcast.com. Thanks for listening.